How's it going, guys? My name is LongBarrel, and today I'm going to be showing you guys my new PC build, and I will also be reviewing the Cougar Panzer-S mid-tower case, which the guys from Cougar were kind enough to send me. Let's get started. So I got the idea of upgrading my computer a while back, and I finally bought all the parts I needed in early October. The parts that I upgraded were the motherboard, CPU, graphics card, and RAM. These 4 parts cost me 2,000 Canadian dollars alone. The rest of the parts I took from my previous rig and the case I got sent from Cougar to make a review on. Let's talk about each part and why I went with them. The specs of this build are as follows: Cougar Panzer-S mid-tower case, EVGA GTX 1080 Ti Superclock Black Edition, Cougar CMX 1000 watt power supply, Asus ROG Strix Z270E motherboard, Intel Core i7-7700K CPU, Corsair Vengeance LPX 16GB 3200MHz DDR4 RAM, Corsair SB120 high performance PWM fans, plus 1 Corsair SB120 high performance case fan, ADATA SX900 256GB SSD, plus W Digital Blue 6TB and 3TB hard drives, and finally a custom water cooling kit from XSPC. First things first, the case. This is the Panzer-S case from Cougar's Panzer series. This particular model is a mid-tower case that comes with 3 red LED 120mm fans pre-installed in the front. It features 2 solid tempered glass windows on both sides of the case. They're also tinted, which makes the inside of the case look really cool. The reason I picked this case is because I needed a case with a lot of space, something windowed, and preferably a mid-tower, as I'm only mounting an ATX motherboard and 1 graphics card. Visually, the case looks really nice, but I'm not really a fan of the wavy, porous top and front grills. I feel like their design is a tad bit outdated, as nowadays it's all about the simplicity and sleekness of cases that attracts the customers. The cool feature about the top and the front panels is you can completely remove them to reveal a ton of space, which makes working in this case incredibly easy. The big tinted tempered glass panels are an amazing touch to the case as well. They give the case a really modern feel, which makes the case really stand out. The top of the case features the standard power switch, reset switch, headphone and mic ports, and 2 2.0 and 2 3.0 USB ports for a total of 4. I like what Cougar did with the versatility of cooling in this case. Both the top and the front allow for up to 3 120mm fans or 2 140mm fans installed, as well as up to a 360mm radiator or a 280mm radiator. On top of that, you can also mount one 120mm fan on the back and even the bottom of the case. As you can see, the cooling aspect of this case is just insane. So the first thing I did was pre-install the CPU in the motherboard before I dropped it into the case. The motherboard you're seeing is the Strix Z270E from Asus ROG. Now, I decided to go with a mid-range motherboard as I'm not really looking for insane features like on the higher tier mobos. I also needed something with RGB, and this one was a really good option. For me, it was between the Gigabyte Aorus Gaming K5 motherboard and the Strix 270E. I went with the Strix simply because it also features onboard Wi-Fi and Bluetooth connectivity. The CPU was also one that I had to do some research on. I wasn't willing to drop $1,000 on the CPU, so the i9 was definitely out. Upon doing some research, it came down to the i7-7800X and the i7-7700K. These two CPUs actually performed very similarly, and I felt that spending an extra $100 on the 7800X was just not worth it. Plus, the 7800K had an insane discount on Amazon for about $387, so I had to get it. I set up my mobile on a motherboard box and dropped the CPU into it and clamped it shut. After popping the I/O shield into the case, it was now time to install the motherboard into the case. I'm not sure why, but I always struggle with lining up the motherboard with the I/O shield. I don't know what it is, but it took me a really long time this time. But either way, after some fiddling, I finally popped it in and screwed it into place. The next thing I decided to do was install the power supply. I salvaged my power supply from my other rig, and fitting with the case, it is also a Cougar product. This power supply is a Cougar CMX 1000 watt 80 plus bronze certified. The reason why I even have a 1000 watt power supply is because before I got my 780 Ti on my old rig, I had an AMD 7990 installed, and if I wanted to crossfire that card, I needed a 1000 watt power supply. Anyways, I ended up keeping it, and I've had no problems with it ever since. To install the power supply in this case, you need to use the provided PSU bracket. I'm not sure why they decided to do this, but I'm assuming it's because the only way to slide the power supply into the case would be through the rear PSU cutout, and it needs to be secured from outside in. Either way, it wasn't a problem, and I got it installed with ease. I'm reusing my backplate from my old rig, and luckily, since I had an LGA 1155 socket, the backplate fits with no problem on the new LGA 1151 socket. A couple of adhesive strips and it easily gets secured on the back. The next part is the CPU water block. Before installing it, I needed to clean the CPU and block with some 99% isopropyl alcohol to make sure a clean contact. The next step was to apply the thermal compound. I used the XSPC stock compound that came with a kit. I went for a cross application, but as you can see, it turned out quite messy. messy and I may have used a little bit too much. Once it was time to install the CPU block, however, it took 3 people to do it, 1 filming, 1 screwing, and 1 holding. The adhesive strips in the back actually pushed the backplate off the mobile a little bit, so it was hard to line up the holes. Either way, a couple of minutes and it was in. At this point, I thought the hard part was over and it was time to install the RAM. Now, the RAM I went with was the Corsair Vengeance LPX 16GB 3200 MHz DDR4 kit. The white looked really sick and I wanted a high performance memory as it wasn't that much of a price difference between the 2400 MHz options. Remember that when installing the RAM, there are recommended installations for 1 stick, 2 stick, and 3 stick configurations. In my particular board, it's set to install it into A2 and B2 slots for 2 stick configuration. Remember that installing RAM into A1 and A2 slots at the same time, for example, may cause your computer to not start at all. Bam! The RAM is in and it's looking sexy AF. So like I mentioned earlier, this case provides a ton of cooling options in terms of mounting your fans and radiators. I had a choice between the top and the front of the case and I decided that top mounted rad would be the best option. I needed the ports to come down on the left because of my reservoir that was going to be mounted on the right. Because the top panels had a good amount of space inside them, it gave me the option to mount my fans on top and my radiator underneath. Unfortunately, there simply is no space for a push-pull configuration, but that's okay because this is a mid-tower case anyways. To get the maximum cooling possible, I always have my rad as intake and my case fans as exhaust. That way, my rad always gets fresh, cool air and my case fans exhaust the warm air inside. The fans I'm using are the 2 Corsair SP120 PWM High Performance Edition fans. PWM fans means their RPM will be adjusted based on the CPU's temperature, so they're not always blasting at max RPM. To install the rad and the fans, all it took was a little bit of holding and 8 screws later, it was in. Alright, so we installed the water block and radiator slash fans. All that's left to do is the reservoir and the tubing. Remember I mentioned this case has no CD drives to hold the reservoir? Well, that actually put me into a very strange position of trying to fit the reservoir into the case. This job was probably the hardest thing we had to do in this whole build, but after some brainstorming and engineering, we found the best solution. Big shout out to my buddy Martin who came up with how we're going to mount it. In order for this to work, we needed to drill 2 holes on the sidewall of the case in line with the screw ports of the reservoir. This would be incredibly easy if the side of the reservoir didn't have an awkward 2mm lip sticking out. When pressed against the sidewall, the lip would make the reservoir hang on an angle. To compensate for that lip, we needed standoffs to match that 2mm lip. So we basically made 2mm thick aluminum washers that then pushed the reservoir off the sidewall. Everything about the reservoir mount was DIY. We drilled into the case, made our own washers, and then tapped the threads on the reservoir. In the end, we screwed everything in. It looked a bit sketchy, but everything felt solid and it definitely worked. Luckily, compared to the lack of a CD drive, there were a good amount of drives to mount my SSD and hard drives. There aren't any traditional drive bays like I mentioned earlier, but there are flat drives that you screw your SSDs and hard drives into that then get screwed into the case. I know, a lot of screwing. The good thing is that Cougar made a total of 6 of these. 4 SSD ones and 2 hard drive ones. I also like the fact that they feature 1 thumb screw to keep it attached. That way you can easily swap out the drive if you need to. I recommend connecting the power cords and SATA cables before you attach the drive. It'll make it a lot easier. I kind of done goofed on that part. I've probably realized that we're kind of going in random order of operations here, but that's alright. It was now time to fit in the tubing. I really wanted to buy new tubing for this build, but unfortunately I couldn't find 7/16 inch inner diameter tubing anywhere to get it in time for this build. That's why I just had to use my old tubing. My order configuration was supposed to be as follows. Pump slash reservoir to radiator, radiator to CPU block, block back to reservoir. So I began fitting and cutting the tubing to make the loop. I ran into my first problems. The first problem was my rad outlet was way too close to the water block to fit properly. So I switched it to the other rad port. This now meant that my water block's inlet port is no longer getting to the rad's outlet. To make this work, I would now have to change my order from pump to block to rad back to reservoir. As you can see in the next clip, I accidentally made my water block inlet port my outlet. I know this all sounds confusing, but to summarize, I basically had my original configuration, except my water block inlet and my outlet port were now reversed by accident. I actually did not notice this before I started to pour the coolant. I'll talk more about that in a bit. The last bit of this was to screw in the compression fittings to make sure nothing pops off and I have no leaks. At last, the final cooling step, adding the coolant and leak testing. If I had to choose again between doing custom water cooling or a closed loop, I'd definitely pick a closed loop. A custom loop takes way too long to set up and test everything. With a closed loop, you can just screw in a couple of screws and you're good to go. The coolant I decided to go with was the only coolant I was able to find that would be here within 1 week, and that was this EK Cryofuel lime yellow color. This stuff actually looks unreal when not see-through, almost like uranium from cartoons and movies. To cycle the coolant through the loop, you need to attach an attachment on the power supply power cable, which which will allow you to toggle the power with the switch on the back of the power supply. Having the pump connected to a Molex power connector, you fill the reservoir to the brim, close the lid, and power on. Once the pump almost starts to run dry, you shut it off and repeat. Once the loop is running consistently, you can just pour into the reservoir without turning the pump off. After all the large air bubbles were gone and the reservoir was full, I left it to purge and leak test overnight. Keep in mind, I didn't install the graphics card just yet. This is in case I do have a leak, my card will be safe. I also left my system covered in paper towels. This way, in case of a leak, the coolant will be sucked up and the color on the paper towels will show me exactly where it is. Alright, I'll admit I cheated a little. I actually installed Windows before I installed my graphics card. That's just the way it turned out. Installing the graphics card is the part I'm always most excited for because it's the most expensive part of the build and it's usually the last component. The card I decided to go with was the EVGA GeForce GTX 1080 Ti Superclock Black Edition, with the base clock being at 1556 MHz and the boost clock being at 1670 MHz. This thing is a real beauty. Top of the line and simply an overkill for Counter-Strike, but that's fine. Installing this beast into the Panzer was fairly easy. After unscrewing a couple of brackets in the back, you just line up the card with the top PCIe slot and push. Now as you can see in the video though, the card actually got caught on something while trying to put it into place. With a little force it eventually gave in, but I don't quite remember what caused it to not go in smoothly. The good thing is about this case is you can fit up to 3 graphics cards with a max length of 425mm. This makes the possibility of upgrading a viable option in the future. I do have a complaint about the rear bracket of the case though. Cougar went with a very tiny graphics card holder screws. This not only makes securing the graphics card harder, but also makes it impossible without a screwdriver. I think changing those screws to thumb screws like they have on the media drive holders would be a better option. The boring and the tedious part of the build was to make sure everything was connected. All panels were attached and to do some basic cable management. The top and front panels have all of the basic power, USB, audio, and LED cables, so I had to pull those through and snap the panel back on. Underneath the front panel, Cougar actually added a cool filter for the fans. It's actually magnetic, so cleaning it is very easy. The case comes with a few zap straps to make your cable management easier. I made sure to utilize those. One of my biggest concerns for this case was how uncomfortable it is to connect stuff into the back of the power supply. What causes this issue is the power supply cover inside of the case. To reach inside, you need to remove the bottom fan in the front or reach from the inside, which is very hard with all the cables running through. I think if they made the cover removable, it would make working inside so much easier. Last part was to attach these heavy tempered glass panels back on and power up the rig. These panels are pure glass, quite heavy, and fingerprints will definitely show, but they look insanely good. The tint makes everything inside look fantastic, and the reflection makes the case stand out by adding some character to the rig. My main concern with them was the obnoxious warning sticker on both panels. Peeling it off left a giant rectangle of adhesive on it, which I had to buff out with a ton of isopropyl alcohol. All of it did come off though, and now it looks spotless. The tint also kind of hides the giant Cougar logo just a tiny bit. I personally don't mind it, but I can see how it could bother some people. It would definitely be cool to see it removable. Unfortunately right now it's permanent, unless you buff it out with like a wire wheel or something. With the panels on, the whole rig became insanely heavy, but the feet of the case allows it to be freely pushed with minimal resistance. Watch out though, without the panels installed, the case does tend to tip to one side very easily. I almost tipped my rig a bunch of times during the build process. I think they could really balance out the case a little bit more so that issue does not come up. So there you have it, my new and improved rig. Over time, I'll probably add more things to personalize this a bit more, but for now, this is exactly what I'm looking for. I also want to add that me reversing the inlet and outlet ports on the CPU block seem to have not affected my temps too much. I idle at around 28 degrees, and under load, it barely goes above 65 degrees Celsius. Some finishing thoughts on the Cougar Panzer-S. I think everything about this case feels solid. There's lots of space, options for cooling, and it just overall looks really nice. However, the imbalance of the case does make it prone to tipping, which catched me out a little. I think the power supply cover inside should be removable to allow for easier access. The big Cougar sign could be smaller or removable, and maybe add another centimeter in the back for cable space. The lack of the drive bays is not an issue for me, as that's just a feature of the case, but I think they can try to make it a bit more obvious for buyers who are not aware of this. I definitely recommend this case if you're looking for an affordable mid-tower case with lots of cooling options, big glass panels, and just general quality. Retailing for around $100 US, you can't go wrong with it. Other than that, that pretty much covers everything. I'm going to go enjoy my new rig. Big thanks to Cougar for sending this to me. Hope you enjoyed the review. As to the rest of you, thank you guys so much for watching. Sorry it was a big video, but we had a lot to cover. This was the review of the Cougar Panzer-S mid-tower computer case and my new PC showcase. The links to Cougar will be down in the description. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video. My name is LongBarrel, and remember, be water, my friends.